Nozipho Mbanjwa spoke to Viswanathan Shankar from Standard Chartered Bank and asked him about his impressions of the WEF 2015. Let's take a look at that interview.
Clearly, we are in a confused situation. Major concerns revolve around commodities, not just oil, but commodities generally. The strengthening dollar, security situation, including terrorism, but also geopolitical tensions, and lastly, the persistent debate which continues from the previous years about inclusion. Are we living in a divided world where top 1% of the people enjoy 47% of the wealth?
How does this confusion translate for emerging and developing markets?
It's a tough one because it depends on your particular situation. So let me just play through the oil. Oil price dropping by almost half is good for oil consuming countries, but it's bad for oil producing countries. But at a different level, if you drop to the consumers of oil, like an airline, it's obviously good for airlines. But it depends on whether you have remained unhedged or you've hedged your oil. Right. If you've hedged, you don't gain the benefit. So it's a mixed bag.
Certainly a mixed bag. Let's maybe focus on one of the shining stars of the emerging market space. It seems as if India has grabbed the spotlight to quite a significant effect in the last couple of months. Did you get a sense that WEF was as excited about the growth of India as we've seen prior to this meeting?
You're absolutely right. Mr. Modi, after his election victory, has really brought momentum back. Yeah. India always had the demographics in its favor. It had the demand in its favor, the consumer domestic demand. But what it has lacked in the recent past is the third D, which is decision making and decisiveness. Right. And that's what Mr. Modi has brought. He's brought confidence back. I think India is clearly looking at an upward trajectory. Right. And he's also been a lucky leader because soon after he takes over power, guess what? Oil drops. And India's import bill is close to $150 billion. So you can do the arithmetic. You save 50%, that's $75 billion straight benefit to the economy. So he's got lots of favorable wins. They're also going about the process of reform in a paced and calibrated manner, not promising a lot and delivering little. The challenge is going to be execution. But in the next 3 or 4 years, it's possible that India has a tipping point where India's growth rate actually exceeds that of China. And wouldn't that be brilliant?
Certainly brilliant for business, but maybe let's touch on a bit of concern. Another emerging market that's under some pressure, Brazil. Give us some insights into the prospects for Brazil as you see it.
Brazil is one of the oil-producing countries that gets impacted by the drop in oil price. Brazil also needs significant reforms. Another challenge that Brazil has relative to, say, China or India is a low domestic savings rate. I mean, China is north of 45%. India is close to 30%. And Brazil's is less than 15%. So, you know, how do you get savings up? Now, I just want to come back to the point I made about the tipping point in India and China. Let's not forget that China, as a 10 trillion economy growing at 7%, still produces India every 3 to 4 years. So let's not forget the significance of the Chinese economy, even at 7%.
One of the key criticisms about WEF as a platform is that many view it as a talk shop, and many of the conversations had here don't translate into action. Let's talk about India and China as you've just put these into context. What kind of practical policy levers do you think might be necessary post this meeting to bring us to that tipping point?
In India, the key movement and the momentum will come when they get the infrastructure right. And I think Prime Minister Modi and his advisors are already focused on it. Yeah. Because India is losing, and that's true for any country, if you don't have the right infrastructure, you lose at least 150 to 200 basis points of growth. I mean, look at Africa as an example. Intra-Africa trade is less than 15% of Africa's trade. Yeah. Manufacturing is 13% of GDP across Africa. One of the key challenges that Africa faces is infrastructure. So coming back to India, I think infrastructure is going to be important. tax reform, labor reform, financial sector reform. There's lots of reforms need to be done. All of us can give the policy prescriptions, but the important thing is executing on them and executing relentlessly and flawlessly over the next 3 to 5 years.
Final question, let me bring you home to Africa and let's get a sense of what do you think as one of the big players African leaders need to be focusing on if we're going to make risk a little bit more palatable and make investment a little bit more attractive?
Again, Africa has got tremendous potential, which is why we at Standard Chartered are excited. It's a crown jewel, and forget all the nonsensical reports you read. We are here to stay in Africa for the long term. We have been there for the last 150. We're going to be there for the next 150. What excites us about Africa? It's the tremendous demographics of Africa, the improving governance in Africa, the vast consumer market in Africa, the consumers, the agricultural potential, the resources, of course, and finally the infrastructure potential of Africa. And I think that's what excites us about Africa.